Sable, Episode 4, Boggs, Part 3 of 3. It started with a cool sensation at the back of his head. Wind. Soon, his shattered nose was filled with the scent of fresh earth and vegetation. Where was he? When he tried to open up his eyes, his blurry vision was pierced by the burning sunlight. Was it morning, or was it late afternoon? He didn't know. There were a lot of things he didn't know, and he wasn't even entirely sure if he had ever had the answers to begin with. "Get up," the voice bellowed and trembled the air around him. It was different, and yet there was something vaguely familiar about it. God, why couldn't he remember anything? "I said, get up." His arm shook as he tried to pull himself up off the ground. Mud, blood, and shards of teeth pouring from his mouth as he did so. Now was when all the pain came back to him. He retched, his entire body on fire. His face slapped against the ground again, vomiting. Why did it hurt so much? "Stand him up, now!" That voice screamed inside his ears, about to burst his drums like a balloon. It wasn't long before two sets of hands grabbed at his shoulders, hiking him up off the ground. That same flame began coursing through his body once again, but there was no way that he could fall to the ground, so he decided to try his hands at opening his eyes once more. What stood before him was a giant of a figure, clad in nothing but dark black feathers. Its face, or maybe a mask it was wearing, was made of sheer bone. Its mouth hung open in a permanent state, revealing a smaller mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth. Its eyes, all four of them, stared at him with such intensity that it made his stomach turn almost instantly. He wanted to close his eyes again, hoping it would wake him from this nightmare. The two things holding him up were walking trees. Their forms were wooden, covered in mold and flowers, and yet they retained a certain humanistic form. They seemed to pay no mind to him, wrapping their thick arms around him to keep him from escaping. They didn't seem to have eyes or mouths, just blank faces of wood, cracked and worn. "Show him his deeds," the giant boomed out, pointing a meaty hand down. The trees obliged, both gripping a side of the back of his head, forcing him to look down at the ground once more. He lost all air in his lungs, and for a moment he felt his heart stop. There, before him, was something much taller than the giant. Its form was almost rock-like, hints of leathery gray skin beneath the cracks and spaces between the boulders. Its face had been destroyed, large craters surrounding the entire surface. Come to think of it, there were an awful lot of chunks taken out of this creature, whatever it had been. The ground around it was a pool of dark, red blood, chunks of rock and flesh floating around. Its arms had been outstretched, hands put out as if to try and stop an oncoming attack. Had he done this? He didn't remember doing such a thing, and the more he thought about it, he didn't even remember this thing being there when he had passed out before. Mage. The two wooden stooges quickly yanked his head back, just in time to allow him to watch the feathered giant stepping over towards him, covering him in shadow. "How do you plea? Do you not stand before me guilty? Were you not responsible for the death of this elder?" He didn't speak. He couldn't, which angered the giant. "Speak up, or I shall judge for you." It leaned down, breathing hot on his face. "And you will not like my verdict." He stared at what was sure to be his death, and yet no words could be formed from his throat or in his mind. Tears began to stream down his face and his body shook. Why couldn't he remember any of this? He couldn't even be sure that he didn't commit the crime. So, he just stood there, in front of his judge, and began to cry. I'm sorry." His body heaved. "I'm so sorry." The giant crossed its arms over its chest, glaring at him as it watched him break down. The two holding him up stood vigilant, not even bothering to steal a glance as it became a blubbering mess. "You've all heard it, haven't you?" There was a gust of wind that rattled his teeth, causing him to clench them. "Yes." "Yes." "We have." The giant nodded towards the voices somewhere off in the distance. "Then I have reached my verdict. Daniel William Boggs, I sentence you to death. May whatever meets you on the other side show you more mercy than I this day." It was cut off, and soon the sound of a wet thud filled the air. The man had been looking down at the time, too scared to face his own death. When he did look, however, he was shocked to see that the giant had no longer been standing there. In fact, neither were the two holding his arms. He was free. His heart went into overdrive and his legs gave out on him. He was still alive. He was still alive. It took him a moment to realize that with the disappearance of his attackers came the vanishing of the forest as well. Everything was black, except a light that circled his form. He couldn't see past the light, an internal darkness meeting his gaze on every side. Where was he now? He wasn't given time to ponder the question as the ground rattled around him. Boggs! A voice shrieked, the sound resembling nails clawing at a chalkboard. It seemed to be coming from everywhere, all at once, like a million voices were crying out to him. He looked around him, above him, below him, and all gave the same results. Nothing. He was alone, but that wasn't true, was it? Like a bolt of lightning, it appeared before him, mere feet from where he sat. The man gulped, scooting backwards, the light following him every inch of the way. The monster did the same, always just out of reach, but there, tilting back and forth on its feet, arms outstretched with fingers dancing in the air. It was thin, too thin to be human, and its skin, if one could call it that, was white burlap. The skin around its face was ripped, jagged threads of burlap hanging off of it to reveal nothing but teeth and eyes that stared right through the man's very soul. It was drooling uncontrollably, clicking and grunting in hunger as it stared at him, rocking in place. It lunged, its many mouths all open in unison, screaming at him with a voice that was primal, unnatural. He felt his very being melting away as he stared at this beast in white. Teeth bit into his flesh, burning him from the inside and out as the skin, muscle, and bone just dissolved away, leaving no trace. This was how he was to die? At the hands of this foul beast without a chance to fight back? It wasn't fair. No words or screams escaped his lips as the creature dined on him, ripping at his face in large chunks. There was no blood, no parts to what was his being. This thing was erasing him, turning him to dust, and he did nothing about it. Mr. Boggs. Daniel, wake up. He was shaken from his sleep, gasping for air and sweating. He wanted to reach out, to grab at anything to prove that it was real, but his arms were confined, wrapped around him underneath a suit that was constricting him. He screamed, shaking in his confines until big hands placed themselves on his shoulders. He stopped as quickly as he began, eyes trailing up the arms that held him so tight. This man was large, rotund even, and his face was covered in hair from the top to bottom. He wore a black shirt that seemed about 2 sizes too small on him, his meaty arms seeming to rip at the fabric itself. He wore a smile on his face the whole time, reassuring and warm, almost enough to calm the frantic man before him. Daniel, you're all right. You had a bad dream, that's all. Do you understand? It wasn't real. Nothing can hurt you here, I promise. Daniel. That was his name after all. It seemed to fit, like he should have known it all along. Just a dream, he muttered, his eyes never leaving the other man's. That's right, Daniel. Just a dream. You're safe here. The man laughed, removing his hands to place them to the side. Now, how about we talk about it? Was it the same dream? He pulled a pen and notepad from his pocket, flipping to a free page. You can tell me, Daniel. I know things have been rough for you these past few months. Somewhere off in the distance, a television was blaring. People screaming, crying. Was it the news? Daniel huffed and looked around his room, his cage, white walls all around him. Yeah, he began, the words forcing themselves out of his mouth faster than he could think. Same dream, same monster. He paused, choking back tears. It actually bit me this time. I usually wake up before it can hurt me, but this time, it ate me alive. I felt myself disappearing, like the memory of me was also being eaten away. The man before him just sat there and allowed Daniel to continue, every now and then scribbling something in his notebook. That television outside, it was getting louder, much more frantic. Though Daniel tried to focus on the matter at hand, he couldn't help but listen to what was going on. He couldn't make out much, something about a lot of people dying? Could you tell them to turn that down? I can't concentrate. The man stood up and walked towards the door, shutting it. Sorry, Daniel. Margaret's enjoying her free time. Can you still hear it? Daniel shook his head. Good. Now, let's get back to you. You said that this thing had actually attacked you? Before Daniel could respond, a nurse came rushing in, slamming the door against the opposite wall. She looked frightened, her face a deathly pale, eyes looking about in every direction with such speed that it made Daniel dizzy. She seemed to find it hard to speak, mumbles escaping her trembling lips as her fingers pointed outside the room. What is it, Rachel? The man called out, barely looking over his shoulder. I'm sorry, Dr. Crow, but it's urgent. Sarah, oh God, she clawed out her own eyes. I went in to feed her, and she's gone. The nurse leaned against the door, crying. She bled everywhere. God's just come with me, please. Crow wasted no time, standing up and heading towards the door, giving a reassuring look towards the nurse. It'll be okay. Let me take care of this. You go sit down. Go home if you need to. He looked towards Daniel. I'll be back in a moment, Daniel. Just stay calm. Everything's gonna be okay. Daniel didn't believe him. Didn't believe any of it. It wasn't long before he was left alone once again. He just stared at the door, waiting for Crow to come back. He felt nothing about Sarah, or the nurse that came in crying like that. Sarah was a nutter. This was bound to happen sooner or later. They needed to take care of him. Couldn't they see that he was the important one here? Wait, this isn't right. Daniel's eyes opened wide as the revelation dawned on him. He would never act like this. He wouldn't be wrapped up in this damn outfit. This wasn't his life. This wasn't his body. None of this was reality, at least not his reality. Soon he began to feel deathly cold, and the smell of the ocean filled his nose. He found it hard to breathe, his chest heaving but with no effect. He needed to get out of this straitjacket, needed to feel the opened air against his skin again. He had to get back to his life. Boggs. He stopped, sweat trickling down his face. Why was everything so damned heavy? He closed his eyes. This was a dream. It had to be. And when he opened his eyes, he'd be back home. He'd be safe. Daniel began to open them slowly, feeling the burn of water filling his vision. He was drowning, being tugged down to the bottom of the ocean. He wasn't deep enough down to not see light shining against the surface of the water, and he tried to reach for it, but he couldn't move a damn part of his body. Where once there was a jacket wrapping him up, there was now multiple burlap creatures wrapping their forms around him, laughing as they pushed him further and further down in the water. He was going to die here, eaten alive or drowned, maybe even both. No. The singular thought rushed through Boggs' mind as he focused his anger, his energy, into the palms of his hands. He wasn't going to die. Not here, anyway. He had lived too long to be taken like this. He'd find the one responsible for this, for placing the curse on Independence, and he was going to ground the bastard's face into the ground until there was nothing but red mist in the air. His oxygen was soon depleted, and the world around him grew dim, but he kept pushing energy through himself, using his body as a conduit. He was the best damned mage there was. This was not where his story ended. Magic isn't easy, despite what Boggs believed when he went to train and hone his abilities. It takes a toll on you and the world around you. The fireballs and monster summoning you've read in stories was practically impossible. The energy needed would destroy you from the inside out. You had to master your limitations and see them as advantages. So, while creating an electrical storm out of thin air would be something you couldn't even dream of doing on land, in the sea, it was a different story. It wasn't long before he emerged from the water, the screams of those monsters filling him with glee. Lights flashed underneath the surface, and he could see their forms dancing in pain. Bastards. That was what happened when you messed with Daniel William Boggs. He removed his duster, leaving it to dry as he tried to get an understanding of where he had ended up. He was back in Independence, but something was different about it. Something he couldn't avoid. The sky above him was as dark as could be. No stars, no moon, just the void of space. There was also a silence about the entire town, one that was more foreboding than comforting, but that was not what made Boggs' heart skip and then stop over and over again. No, it was the thing that stood before him, in the middle of the main road, nearly splitting the town in two. It was a spire made of sheer red glass. There was not a single scratch or dent in the smooth surface, at least none that Boggs could easily make out from all the way down here. It seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the void above with no sign of stopping. There was an energy about this place, something strong, powerful, and yet familiar, like he had always felt this presence inside of him. He looked about, hoping to find someone, anyone, to explain all of this to him. How long had he been gone? What was this doing here? Before he could ponder any further, he felt someone behind him, his head slowly turning to look over his shoulder. To put it simply, she was gorgeous, and even that was an understatement. Her skin was as black as the night sky, dots of stars all over her nude form. Her hair was long, flowing, and it was the purest white one could only dream of creating. There was a warmth that followed her, one that soothed all of Boggs' fears, and for a moment, he had forgotten about everything, about the nightmares and about the monsters. "I was worried I wouldn't find you," she whispered, her voice a symphony of angels singing in harmony. "I was worried I had lost you." Boggs stood there in blissful silence for a moment, no words daring to break it. "Daniel, I need to get you out of here. You're in serious danger." Her words rung true, and all the memories flooded back into Boggs' mind. "Where is everyone?" he asked, leaning against the spire before him. What's all of this?" The woman seemed to float towards him, her hair flowing behind her, though there was no wind to speak of. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I was hoping our meeting wouldn't be this way, but I can't stop the past. I can only prevent the future." She placed a hand on his cheek. "You've been deceived, wronged, and I'm here to show you the way to safety. I want to free you from these bonds they've put you in." "Who's they?" She paused for a moment, looking at this poor, pathetic creature before her. She chewed at her lip in thought, trying to think of the words. "Daniel, there was never a curse. There was never a murder here. There was no witch. You were led here so that they could harm you, so that they could steal you from me, and the others out there that see the truth." Daniel swallowed hard, his body feeling weak. "You haven't answered the question. Who are they?" Somewhere off in the distance, doors began to open, and Boggs heard the all-too-familiar growls and clicks. There were more of them. "The people here were never what they said they were. They know you're powerful, a fighter for the truth, and that scares them. You've been fighting against them all this time, even if you never knew it yourself. I'm begging you, help me and the others like you stand up against these horrible things." The woman grabbed for his shoulders. "You need to make sure that they never harm anyone again, that no one else suffers what you did. Be the sword they can't shatter. Be the champion they should and will fear." She released him. "Then, when the time is right, find us, and we shall welcome you into the fold with open arms. We can win this. You can win this." She began to dissolve right in front of him, and more doors began to open everywhere, the entire town coming alive once again. "Prove to them that they can't win. The truth shall always be louder than the lies, and you're the speaker from which the truth rings the loudest." Soon there was no woman, no spire. Boggs stumbled about, his mind racing. She was speaking the truth. There was always something weird about this case, something that was hidden underneath, too far to see when he first arrived. The town was so eager for him to help, and yet they were hesitant to give him any information. Some even thought it was best to act like nothing ever happened to begin with. Had Crow been lying the entire time as well? Surely it would have known about any witches or curses. Why had it not spoken up about the murders? It would have seen them, would have heard about them at the very least. As the creatures in white surrounded him on all sides, the puzzle had been put in place. Independence wasn't real. The people just masks that these monsters wore. How many innocent lives had they taken? How many hopeless people had died at the hands of their mind games? It didn't matter anymore. That number wasn't going to rise, not while Boggs had some fight in him. "You fucked with the wrong mage," he growled, feeling their rancid breath all over him. He grabbed the one closest to him, his hands burning the thing alive, its mouth filled with flames that were melting it from the inside out. It squirmed and writhed until it fell to the ground, dead. Another reached for him, and it met the same fate, burnt to a crisp. There were at least 40 of them left, and Boggs was ready to take them all on. No one was ever going to be hurt by them again. No one. He let out a guttural scream as he moved through their ranks, taking them down one by one. Some tried to flee, holding their wounded brethren close, but Boggs wasn't allowing them an escape. They'd all meet their end tonight, this cursed ground soaking in their blood. The woman was right. He was a champion, and it was high time that these things feared him. Samuel Tanis whistled an old tune his father had taught him many years ago as he walked the path to independence. It was the end of the month, which meant every farmer who wanted to make money was heading up to the town to sell their wares. He had the longest travel, which usually meant that he was the last to get there, only setting up shop for a day. It wasn't a matter to him. He still made 2 months' worth of money in one day. He did find his journey odd, though. As he neared the town, he hadn't spotted a single soul on the road, not even a cart from another farmer. The air was filled with a silence that caused him hesitation. He had always been able to tell when something wasn't right, but this time, he couldn't think of what could possibly have him this spooked. It wasn't long before the scent filled his nose. It was a mixture of burning fat and rotting meat. A carcass nearby? No, this was too strong a scent from one body. His legs moved him further up the road, faster. Something was terribly wrong, and he needed to see for himself. The smell grew more and more intense the closer he reached Independence, and he soon saw himself looking at the cause, falling to the ground and praying to his God. The town had been burnt to the ground. Not a single building left standing. The streets were filled with debris and the bodies of dead, burnt villagers. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. They had all seemed to meet the same fate, burnt to a crisp. And there, standing in town square surrounded by corpses, was a singular man. He was nude, his skin burnt from the sun above. All over him he had marked himself with what looked like red paint, formed into a spire. He was rocking back and forth, hands clutching his side. "I'm the speaker of truth," Samuel could hear him cry out as he stomped the head of one of his victims to dust. "I'm the speaker of truth." He fell to the ground, his shoulders heaving up and down. At first Samuel was sure he was crying, maybe even with remorse, but no, he was laughing. Laughing as hard as he ever had before. Sable was written and narrated by me, Lane Lloyd. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, or just follow my antics, you can always find me on Twitter, at @the_Lane Lloyd. That's LANELLOID. Sable's theme song, Unfamiliar Places, was performed by Alex Lankford and Trevor Eilers, and you can find a link to the song in our show notes for the show. As always, you can find us on iTunes and Stitcher, and while you're there, why not leave the show a rating or a comment, or hell, tell your friends about the show too. There has been some confusion as to whether or not this was the last episode of Sable, and the answer is no, this was just the last episode of the Boggs story. We'll be back next week with another episode, and we still have at least a few weeks before Season 1 ends, so we've got some exciting things going on for you. I don't know why I'm saying we. It's just me doing this. Oh god, am I going crazy? Oh shit. I gotta go and check myself into an asylum real quick. So this has been Lane Lloyd, and this has been Sable, and have a good week. You deserve it. Treat yourself a little bit.